Welcome back. We are continuing with Going Native, written by Uncle Ceiling. Going Native, Chapter 4. Stace tried to play nurse to the large soldier in his bed, with limited success. He thought he was doing a good job until Ian pushed him away. Through some gestures, Stace got the vague impression that Ian had decided that it was his job to care for the woman from now on, since Stace already did his part. Either that or Ian was trying to protect the giant from Stace for some reason. It was hard to tell. With no common language, Stace wasn't sure how he was going to manage to teach Ian everything he was going to need to know to survive out here. The supplies he had stored up for the winter wouldn't last them long with 3 people, and even with 2 it would be touch and go. Especially since Stace was sure that the massive woman would eat for 2 on her own once she was up. You didn't get that big on 2,000 calories a day. The storm would likely take another day or 2 to pass completely, Stace knew. It had come on quickly and it would leave quickly, but until then there wasn't much to do. The first time Stace had grabbed his wooden snow shovel and went to clear off the roof, Ian had acted like he was going to help. As soon as the door opened, though, the little guy was shivering so bad he looked like he was going to vibrate over. The human had tried to tell the lilac alien to go inside, but he just put on a brave face and tried to stick it out. Stace had closed the door, then bodily lifted Ian up by the shoulders and sat him in the chair in front of the fire. That settled that. After clearing the roof, Stace limped in and warmed himself up as best he could. Ian was glaring at him, but clearly hadn't moved from his seat. Stace looked the little alien over, still wearing the same battered clothes he fell to earth in, and had an idea. Digging through one of the wooden chests piled against one wall, he came up with a heavy long-sleeved cotton shirt and some long underwear. Both were in fairly rough shape, with holes and stains, but that could all be mended. Convincing Ian to stand there and wear the hilariously oversized clothing while Stace figured out how to take it in took some doing, but Stace couldn't help but smile at the result. Ian was cute when he blushed. The size difference between the 2 of them turned out to be a lot more helpful than Stace had expected. He was able to take in the clothing by cutting out the damaged sections, and in the end he had enough fabric left over from the pant legs to make some thin cotton gloves. Sewing wasn't his best skill, but he had needles and thread and had years of doing his own mending to help bridge the gap. It wasn't going to win any fashion awards, but the lilac alien seemed happy to have another layer of clothing between himself and the winter chill. By the end of their first real day together, Stace felt like the 2 of them had made real progress. They had gotten at least a few gestures down, and the 2 of them could say yes, no, and at least a couple swears in each other's language. They had a pleasant meal together, though Stace realized that he was going to have to make some more cutlery and such. Trying to eat with a ladle while Ian had the only regularly sized spoon was just a little humiliating. Stace ended the evening by grabbing every blanket, hide, and fur he could find that was in good condition and making up a bed of sorts by the fire for Ian. Stace took his blanket, wrapped himself up as best he could in his chair, and tried to drift off to sleep, ignoring the strange looks he was getting from the alien lying on the floor. Stace was infuriating. Ian was sure of it. He had suspected it when the human had picked him up like a child and sat him down when he tried to be helpful, though, truth be told, Ian was grateful for not having to go into that blizzard outside. His suspicions were reinforced when Stace humiliated him by making him wear those gigantic clothes so he could take them in. Did the man not own a measuring tape? But now, after this morning, Ian was sure of it. Stace had assumed that Ian was asleep, but it had gotten too hot under his pile of blankets and animal skins. Ian had looked over and watched as Stace climbed out of his chair, wincing in pain and trying to stretch the kinks out of his back. The floor was hard, but it was at least flat, and between the furs and the blankets Ian had been comfortable while Stace had apparently twisted himself silly trying to sleep in a goddess-damned chair of all things. That human had been treating Aang like he was the cute little prince and Stace was the big strong warrior princess come to rescue him, and honestly he didn't know how to react. He was scared for the future and he missed his wife, but Stace gave off a feeling of stability. This place he was stuck in was old and lived in, and Stace must have been here for a long time. Aang could feel the gravity of the place, like Stace's life in the middle of this horrible corner of this bizarre planet had somehow pulled him to it, and now he was caught by its pull. Caught by an idiot who was clearly not taking care of himself. Aang had seen Stace limping worse when he woke up and had feigned sleep while the human changed the bandages on his feet, wincing and tapping his toes with his fingers to test for sensation. It was obvious Stace wasn't pleased with the results. Aang lay there in thought, eyes closed, trying to discern a way through this situation. He had to treat it like an exercise in one of his preparatory classes. Lay out the problems, find the ones with solutions, solve those first. He let the words form like a list in his head, glowing letters in the blackness. Problem 1, I am stranded on an alien world and everyone probably thinks I am dead. Not much I can do about that. Problem 2, outside is a frozen hellscape that will kill anybody dumb enough to go outside. Can't do much about that either. Problem 3, I have no way to contact the outside world. Again, no immediate way to solve it. Problem 4, my infuriating but kind of lovable native guide is a dumbass when it comes to taking care of himself. This one I can work with. It's almost like being home with Marion. Feigning that he just woke up, Aang let out a loud yawn and stretched while Stace hurriedly finished wrapping his feet back up, doing a very poor job of looking nonchalant. He might as well have been singing to himself. While Stace wrapped himself up in his blanket, Aang started reorganizing the pile of fur and cloth he had been using as a bed. Once he had it spread out a bit, Aang went over to where Stace was curling back up in his chair. Stace! The human didn't react. The human didn't react. Stace! The human opened an eye and looked at Aang, then said some human word that Aang didn't understand. Grunting in exasperation, Aang wrapped his thin fingers around Stace's wrist and pulled. The human got up to his feet warily, clearly unsure of what was going on. Pulling the somewhat resistant human like a child, Aang pointed at the makeshift bed.
Get in the bed.
What?
Get in the bed, you idiot. You're going to hurt yourself sitting in a chair.
Stace pointed at Aang, then pointed at the bed. Then he pointed at himself, and pointed at the chair. Aang was really beginning to get tired of this. He pointed at Stace, then the bed, then himself, then the bed again. When Stace's face began to redden slightly and his eyes opened just a little wider, Aang knew the point was made. Aang had been a little worried with his plan. If Stace was a woman and Aang made this sort of suggestion, there was no way it would end well. There would be expectations that come with this type of invitation and the two of them didn't have the language to talk it out. He thought it would be safer with a male, but he had heard the stories about how sex-crazed humans were, how they didn't even care about the sexes and would rut with any and everything. Somehow, those rumors just didn't seem real when compared to the genuine article. Still, he wasn't expecting the reaction he got. Stace shook his head, brushed Aang's hand aside, and turned to head back to the chair. He got about a step before Aang's hand slapped the back of his head. Stace turned, looking surprised more than hurt.
You idiot. Bed. Now.
Aang pointed and, with a sigh, Stace clambered his way down onto the floor. Aang noticed that he took the spot farthest from the fire, but he wasn't going to argue it. Aang laid down between the human and the fire and it wasn't long before both were fast asleep. In the morning, Aang awoke to a warm breath tickling his ear. He thought of Marion for a moment, her strong arms and powerful legs wrapping him up after a night of lovemaking, but he came to his senses quickly. He was still in the little cabin, his back and hips pressed up against not his wife but a male, a human male of all things. One of Stace's arms was draped over him, but he was hardly trapped. He felt warm and comfortable in a way he hadn't for a long time. Ian closed his eyes and rocked himself backwards a little, feeling Stace close up around him, arm wrapping tighter and some alien words mumbled in his ear. For the first time since the crash, Ian truly believed that everything would work out. Stace woke up to the smell of frying food and a refreshing lack of an ache in his back. He stretched out and let out a deep groan of pleasure, nearly tripping the small booted feet standing between him and the fire. Ian was there, frying something in the small cast iron pan Stace had dragged with him from civilization. Only letting out a small wince of pain, Stace clambered to his feet and leaned over Ian's shoulder to look. There were caribou sausages frying in the pan, spitting and hissing. Clearly Ian had raided the pantry while Stace was asleep. As Stace watched, still bleary, Ian took 2 wooden skewers and deftly flipped the sausages with one hand, shaking the pan with the other.
"Don't overcrowd them,"
Stace said, reaching out to point at the pan only to earn a quick and light slap across the knuckles with the skewers. He put on a hurt face and a fake frown, then turned away with a grin. He didn't need to look to know Ian had a matching smile, if a little more toothy. Tusky? Stace gave himself a mental reminder to look up the difference between tusks and teeth. Once Stace was fully stretched and had made a quick trip to the outhouse, it was time to examine their patient. She seemed to be sleeping calmly, with no trace of fever. He pulled up a corner of the bandages and examined the incision and puncture site. The staples were holding it together and the flesh seemed to be healthy, if red and raw. His brain dredged up the word granulation as he looked at the wound. It was healing well and significantly faster than he had expected it to. Maybe she was genetically modified or had nanobos, or there was an implanted medical tracker releasing hormones, or any number of things. Or maybe she just healed fast. Stace honestly had no clue. Breakfast was quick but nice. Ian seemed to be well satisfied by the grunts of pleasure and thanks Stace gave him while eating, but truth be told Stace's mind was wandering. He was trying to remember the last time someone had cooked for him. If he didn't count restaurants or drive-through. Stace snapped to attention at hearing his name called. Ian was offering him the last of the sausages, a look of concern on his face at the human's distance. Stace shook his head to the negative, then began to get dressed.
"I am going to check for storm damage, maybe do some fishing. We need more food."
He knew the alien couldn't understand him, but he felt like he had to at least say something. After a moment of staring at each other, Stace pointed at himself and the door, then at Ian and the soldier before pointing at the floor.
"I am going out, you two stay here."
Ian nodded and began tidying up the dishes. Snow was still falling, but most of the storm had passed and the large, fluffy flakes were more of a mild inconvenience than anything else as Stace began inspecting his little cabin and the surrounding grounds. Over the years he had built something he could be proud of, but as he looked it over Stace couldn't help but wonder if maybe it was time to move on. Things had been changing in the world outside and he might want to be a part of it again. Then again, he might not live to see it. Time would tell. As soon as Stace was gone, back outside in the cold, Ian did something he had promised himself he wouldn't do. He started snooping. Well, it wasn't snooping, he told himself. He was going to be living here, and if that was the case he would need to know exactly what was going on, what was available. He couldn't be helpful if he didn't have a firm grasp on the situation. Ian had taken stock of the provisions in the cellar/cooler/pantry type room in the morning, and even if he didn't recognize most of the vegetables or strange cuts of meat he could at least tell what was edible. He had recognized the sausage as a component in the stew they had the night before, and Ian was proud of his cooking skills when he had an actual kitchen to work with instead of, well, this. Next on his list was the strange room that led to the outside. It was an airlock of sorts, separating the cold outside from the warm inside. Stace used the vestibule for storing tools, outdoor layers of clothing, and other odds and ends that could handle the cold. To the left was a small door he had missed at first, leading to perhaps the worst part of being stranded here, the outhouse. A literal hole in the ground to shit in while sitting on a smooth piece of wood. The first time he used it, Ian was sure he was going to end up with butt splinters or fall into the dark abyss below. It was freezing in there too, barely warmer than the outside. After giving one last glare at the outhouse door, Ian went back into the main room. There were lots of boxes, crates, and even a chest of drawers to look through. As he inspected each, he could see a sort of progression. The oldest, most battered boxes were also the most crudely made, and each successive generation seemed to improve in quality. The least banged up was the small dresser. Since that would be the easiest to check, and the easiest one to hide the evidence, he decided to look that over first. The top drawer slid open easily and revealed a piece of oiled leather folded over, hard lumps underneath. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing two weapons of unfamiliar design. On was some sort of long gun, a meter of dark wood and matte silver steel. Holding his hand up to the stock, Ian noticed that his fingers would be going through loops of steel, a smaller loop for his trigger finger and a larger one for the rest. Across the top was a magnifying optic made of glass and metal. Below the rifle was a handgun, a very different design than what Ian had found in the duffel bag, but still instantly recognizable in its function. He could see 5 individual empty chambers in a circular pattern attached to the frame and a large grip with a spiked lever above it. The barrel was a tube wide enough he could slide a finger in. Underneath both was a box made of paper and stained with oil. Ian's hands trembled slightly as he opened it and looked inside. The ammunition inside gleamed, straight brass cases with darker copper caps. Ian slipped one out and held it in his hand. It was nearly the size of his thumb. He knew very little about weapons in general, but the sheer size and weight of it left him uneasy. He carefully slid the round back in the box, then put everything back and closed the drawer. Of course Stace would have a weapon. There were probably Turok-sized monsters out there, and there was meat in the pantry. Knowing where it was in case of an emergency is a good thing. Perhaps Ian could convince Stace to show him how they work. That would make him feel more at ease, at least. Ian was about to continue with the next drawer when he was stopped by a quiet noise coming from the bed behind him. End of chapter. If you enjoyed, like, subscribe, and visit the author, and I'll see you next time. If you didn't, comment on what I can do better. And as usual, have a wonderful day.